Okay, so we're going to be starting Unit 4, which is, as you can see on the slide, World War II, and then the beginning of the Cold War. So this is a pretty big unit. We're going to cover all of World War II, and then we're going to be covering the bits and pieces that are sort of the start of the Cold War, and that includes the Korean War, the Berlin Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we're going to be covering a lot of information in this unit, so make sure you're taking good notes. As always, pause it, rewind it whenever you need to. Use the recording to your advantage. And we're going to be relying really heavily on a lot of information from World War I. So if there's anything that you're sort of confused about that I'm referencing, please feel free to go back to your World War I notes from Unit 3 to sort of get that straight. So let's flash back to 1919 when the Allies gathered in Paris at the Paris Peace Conference to write the Treaty of Versailles to end World War I. Now, Germany, remember, didn't even get to attend the Paris Peace Conference, and a lot of Germans really resented that the Allies just sort of made up all these rules and that the Germans weren't allowed to defend themselves. Italy and Japan had also they were at the peace conference, but they had expected to be more rewarded than they actually were because both of them were also part of the Allies. So basically, on both sides, many people were leaving the Paris Peace Conference feeling hurt and, like they weren't respected or supported, and because of that, these feelings are really going to fester, and they're going to turn into a desire for vengeance. So as we get into the 20th century, we're going to see a new theory of government emerging called totalitarianism. And totalitarianism is much more extreme than a dictatorship, and it's pretty much unique to the 20th century. We hadn't seen it really before this moment, and we haven't really seen any totalitarian governments since the 20th century because they've sort of been proven to be faulty and corrupt. So a totalitarian government is a theory of government in which a single party or leader controls the economic, social, and cultural lives of its people. So the way this is more than a dictatorship is it's not just there might be a dictator in a totalitarian government, because I'm sure you're looking at the slide thinking, all these guys are dictators, and they are. So there can be a dictator in a totalitarian government, but the totalitarian government is based off of a political party. It is a party, not like a dynasty, like a family dynasty or anything that's sort of running the show. So there's 7 characteristics to a totalitarian government. 1 is the single party control over all of life. 2 is often there is a strong charismatic leader, like the 3 men that we see on the slide. 3 is the government control of the economy. 4 is the use of military and terror to enforce the government's will. 5 is the government control of media and propaganda. 6 is using schools to brainwash children and spread party beliefs. And 7 is the censorship of any open-mindedness or free thinking. So we're going to look into each of these guys a little more specifically and see how all of these different totalitarian governments take rise in each of these countries. So Vladimir Lenin, remember, he's the founder of the Communist Party in Russia, who staged the Bolshevik Revolution back during World War I, and that's why the Russia is now the USSR, the United Soviet States of Russia. So Lenin died in 1924, and when he died, this new fellow right here, Joseph Stalin, took his place. And Stalin was known to be a really cruel and ruthless leader. Throughout his reign, he's responsible for the death of at least 10 million people, so even more than Hitler, more than the Holocaust. For example, there was a time while he was in power called the Great Terror, where he executed all of the top leaders of his party and his army because he was worried that they were becoming too powerful and that they might try to overthrow him. As for this guy, this is Benito Mussolini. Italy was very bitter after World War I that they didn't get more land from the division of Austria-Hungary in the Treaty of Versailles. And they also experienced a post-war depression where a lot of returning veterans couldn't find jobs, and there was this growing communist movement that was threatening the government's power. And if you wanted change, but you didn't want to be a communist, most of those people ended up leaning towards the fascist movement. So in 1919, Benito Mussolini founds the Fascist Party, and all of his followers were known as the Black Shirts. They started fighting in the streets against communists and socialists, like attacking people in the streets, and he started taking over Italy, like city by city, little by little. And in 1922, the King of Italy was worried that he was going to be killed in this like forced takeover of the government. So he just asked Mussolini to form a new government and like gave control of Italy over to Mussolini. So Mussolini named himself Il Duce, which is basically, you know, the dictator of Italy, and he took complete control. And one thing that he's really known for is like very harsh censorship and tactics against his opponents and critics. And then on to this guy, definitely the most well-known out of these three, and I'm sure the one that you know the most about. So after World War I, Germany became a democracy called the Weimar Republic. But it was never truly successful because they had such high inflation and such a weak economy. If you see this picture in the bottom right-hand corner, that's money that people are raking up and dumping into the street. And that woman is shoving cash into an incinerator because it's worth more to her as fuel than it is as money. Now, we saw something unique in Germany after World War I, and it's called hyperinflation. If you remember in American history, we talked about hyperinflation in the Confederacy during the Civil War. And it's going to happen here after World War I to Germany, only even more extreme. That inflation was like even crazier. Like I said, people would leave giant piles of money out on the street because it was worthless. Like if you were walking down an alley or something and you saw a giant pile of paper, like just blank paper sitting out on the street, you wouldn't be like, oh, I'm going to steal all this paper, because it doesn't mean anything to you. And that's basically what money became to people in Germany. It was like totally worthless. And then in the 1930s, that depression that swept across the globe because of the stock market crash in New York, it hit Germany especially hard. And so when that happens, we're going to see more of these radical political parties forming, and one will be the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party. Now, the name is kind of a trick because they're not socialists. They actually murdered and attacked socialists. They are fascist, but that's just sort of the literal translation in English comes with the word socialist. And they'll obviously be led by this guy right here, Adolf Hitler. So in the late 1920s, Hitler attempted a rebellion against the Weimar Republic and tried to overthrow it from a beer hall, like a pub, and it totally failed. Some of his followers were killed, and it ended up putting him in jail. And a lot of people thought that was the end of Hitler and the end of the Nazi Party. While he was in prison, though, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle in English. And in the book, he blamed most of his hardships on Germany. On Jews. And he blamed most of Germany's hardships on Jews, but not just Jews, but communists as well. He really targeted communists also. And that's when you have discrimination against Jewish people, that's called anti-Semitism. So you've probably heard that phrase before, anti-Semitism, if you're anti-Semitic. He also talked about a couple of other things that I want you to make sure you get down. The first is Lebensraum. So Lebensraum translates to living space in English. And so he's literally talking about the physical geography of Germany. And so he talked a lot about wanting to reunify the Lebensraum. Remember in the Treaty of Versailles, we took a lot of land away from Germany and use it to do other things. We gave some to France. We used some to make Czechoslovakia. We used some to make Poland. We did a bunch of different things with German land, and he wants it all back. The other thing he talked about is something called eugenics. And eugenics is basically perfect genes, the idea that you can sort of breed out or eventually get rid of generation after generation. You can get rid of undesirable traits. Those undesirable traits might be anything like mental illness, physical ailment, something like that. Now, eugenics isn't necessarily always a bad thing. It's not, and by that I mean it's not always a bad idea in some people's minds. Like a lot of people, even back then, were really supportive of the idea of eugenics. FDR, for example, and Woodrow Wilson both believed in eugenics. Even today, there are people who practice and are pursuing, the path of eugenics. Chrissy Teigen and John Legend, for example, chose the sex of their baby through a a fertility clinic. They specifically wanted a baby girl, and now with the technology that we have today, doctors were able to make sure that the child that they had was in fact a girl. That is eugenics. Controlling biology and DNA is what that is. But Hitler's idea of eugenics was definitely different than that. He wants to breed out any undesirable quality that he sees, anything that doesn't line up with his idea of like the perfect Aryan race. That could be anything from homosexuality, blindness, deafness, mental instability, alcoholism, anything like that that might not even necessarily be a genetic trait. He wants to sort of breed all these things out. So as things get more difficult in Germany, the Nazi Party gains more and more numbers. And in 1933, they held a presidential election where Hitler ran, and he received 11 million votes. He lost, though, because there were lots of other political parties in Germany at the time, and a lot of them voted for the other guy. But because he had gotten so many votes, the new president thought they should give him some type of position. So the new president appointed Hitler to the Chancellor of Germany. He was given a lot of power, and he's going to go relatively unchecked by the Reichstag, which is the not British, but it's the German parliament, which is like German Congress. So Hitler's going to be the absolute epitome of a totalitarian leader. Every one of those characteristics that we talked about, the Nazi Party is going to fit right into. And by the 1930s, as he gets into the 1930s, Hitler's political and economic policies are going to totally end the Depression in Germany. And so a lot of people are going to be really supportive of him in the beginning, before they really are totally clear on what exactly is going on behind the scenes. Now, Japan's going to be a little bit different because they don't exactly have one specific dictator. They are more run by the party as a whole, and the party in Japan is actually going to be the military. So in the 1920s, after World War I, Japan also became a democracy, and they were doing like all the right things. They reduced the size of their military, sort of a sign of good faith to everyone that they weren't planning on going to war anytime soon. The United States was doing the same thing, by the way. They gave all men the right to vote, which was actually progress for Japan, because before that you had to be wealthy to vote, but now we're saying all men can vote, so that's at least a step in the right direction. They were legalizing unions, and they had very diverse political parties, and things were going really well. But when the Great Depression swept across the entire world in the 1930s, all the civilian leaders who had pushed for democracy were totally discredited, and everyone was like, well, we tried democracy, and now look where we are. We're in an economic depression. It must be because of democracy. So the military leaders in Japan actually took over control and argued that they were the ones that should be in charge. They totally, overhauled the government, and they announced to the world, or to Japan at least, that the only way to get back on their feet would be to expand and essentially conquer all of Asia. And so that's what they're going to set out to do. Now, Japan will remain under the power of an emperor. You see him here on the right, Emperor Hirohito. But he's really going to be more of a figurehead. The military in general is going to be mostly calling the shots. So World War II actually really begins here in Japan in 1931, when Japan invades this northeastern region of China called Manchuria. And they invade Manchuria, and they set up a puppet government, and they call it Manchukuo, and basically set it up so that they're doing whatever it is that China, or whatever it is that Japan wants. And by 1937, they've just kept taking over province after province, and by 1937 they have control of pretty much all the railway hubs in China, as well as all the natural resources. And by that point, you've pretty much got the entire country. All that's left is the capital, and they will make it to the capital in 1937. And that event is called the Rape of Nanjing. At the time, Nanjing was the capital city. And it's called the Rape of Nanjing because of how violent and absolutely awful the Chinese people were treated when the Japanese military arrived. Tens of thousands of children and women were raped when the Japanese army invaded. They killed more than 200,000 people. They burned a lot of the city to the ground. They just absolutely destroyed it. And that's really all of this is what kicks off the war in Asia. And World War II is going to start off as 3 wars, and this is when the first one begins. The war in Asia is with all of this, the invasion of Manchuria and the takeover of China by Japan.